Opening the center with a pawn thrust immediately stakes a claim and prepares development. Developing the knight to a flexible square, this offers sound defense and keeps options open for pawn breaks. Securing central space, c4 boldly contests the d5 square and prepares a queenside expansion. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the king's bishop, this choice gracefully opens lines for future piece activity. Solidifying the center's dominion, this knight elegantly prepares for queenside expansion and anticipates future pawn advances. Establishing central presence, black immediately challenges white's queenside pawn thrust, seeking dynamic equilibrium. Solidifying central control, white prevents black's immediate c5 and prepares for a fight for space on the queenside. Black surrenders central space to recapture material, initiating a positional gamble. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop opens lines for a swift central buildup. Securing the b5 square, this pawn aims to restrict white's knight and prepare for a queenside pawn advance. Aspiring to control the queenside, this maneuver aims to restrict black's bishop on c8 and potentially create weaknesses on the b5 square later. It's a subtle positional ambition, though it concedes some initiative in the center and might invite black to push their pawns forward, gaining space and freedom for their pieces. The long-term value hinges on whether white can exploit the pawn structure created. Instantly, black challenges white's central pawn ambitions by contesting the d-file and opening lines for the queen. This creates a dynamic pawn structure, potentially leading to exchanges and a battle for piece activity, while also solidifying the queenside pawn chain. Clearing the path for the queen's bishop to dominate the long diagonal is the immediate benefit here, though it does invite a central pawn challenge, potentially sacrificing a tempo if black responds aggressively. Observe how this piece's repositioning creates a subtle pressure point on the queenside, subtly restricting black's future development. Asserting pressure on the d4 pawn, this piece development aims to solidify black's central presence and prepare for a potential pawn advance or knight transfer, while also unpinning the bishop. Castling decisively fortifies the king, completing a vital part of development and preparing for active piece play while simultaneously eyeing open central files for potential future thrusts. Developing the bishop to its most active square now prepares to castle and consolidates the central pawn structure, while keeping the queen's bishop options open for future development. Unlocking the queen's potential, this maneuver aims to support the e3 pawn and potentially bring the queen to a more active square, like h5, to survey the kingside. It prepares for potential central pawn breaks while ensuring the king remains safe for now. The queen's new position subtly influences the c4 square and prepares for a possible kingside attack or defensive repositioning. Safeguarding the monarch amid the evolving pawn structure streamlines development, preparing for central engagement. Opening the d-file to support a potential pawn push or exert pressure on black's queenside is a sensible strategic redirection of force. Unlocking the queen's potential is the immediate objective, preparing for a more active role beyond merely supporting the center. This repositioning subtly aims to contest the d-file and potentially offer support for future pawn pushes on the queenside, fostering a more dynamic pawn structure for black. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing to expand on the flank is the idea behind this advance, preventing any immediate counterplay by black with c4 and creating a robust defensive barrier. The capture of the pawn on d4 immediately injects a dose of dynamism into the center, challenging white's spatial advantage and forcing a rethinking of piece deployment. Black is not just regaining material, but actively seeking to disrupt white's harmonious development, potentially opening lines for counterplay that were previously contained. This bold decision signifies a willingness to embrace complexity and explore the tactical nuances that this pawn exchange might unleash. Opening the central files now grants white significant influence, creating a dynamic pawn structure where your central pawns are poised to advance. The knight's leap to the edge of the board, seemingly adventurous, aims to dislodge white's central pawn structure and potentially challenge the light-squared bishop's dominion. By placing the knight on a5, black seeks to create imbalances and exploit any hesitation from white in solidifying their central control, perhaps forcing a concession or opening up new lines of attack. This maneuver forces white to consider immediate responses rather than continuing with a quiet development, injecting a dose of tactical realism into the otherwise positional game. Establishing control over the long diagonal, this bishop repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential weaknesses in black's queenside structure and supporting white's central pawn presence. Reclaiming the central tension, the rook reposits to a more active square, preparing to contest the semi-open e-file and support a potential kingside advance. The knight boldly ventures forward, seizing central space and threatening to disrupt black's developing harmony. This aggressive positioning aims to create immediate discomfort, forcing a reaction and potentially opening lines for further attack. It's a proactive stance that probes for weaknesses in the opponent's setup. Securing the knight on a5, while preparing to develop the bishop to b7 enhances black's queenside control and opens a pathway for the bishop to contribute to the central struggle. The knight now occupies an imposing central outpost, eyeing potential breakthroughs and exerting pressure on black's queenside while simultaneously preventing the inconvenient nb4 advance. The knight's relocation to c4, capturing the bishop, triggers a fascinating geometric redistribution of pieces across the board. This exchange has opened up the queenside files, transforming the usual quiet pawn structure into a dynamic battlefield ripe for maneuvering. The doubled pawns, while structurally weakening in the long run, now grant white increased influence over the central c-file and a more robust pawn chain, a welcome compensation for the material recaptured. Observe how this pawn recapture immediately bolsters white's central control and prepares for potential pressure down the newly liberated c-file, forcing black to carefully consider their piece placement and counterplay. The knight's venture to e4, a daring exchange, seeks to dismantle white's solid pawn structure and open lines, but it leaves black's queenside vulnerable. Recapturing with the queen immediately intensifies the central confrontation, placing immediate pressure on black's pawn structure and opening a diagonal for the queen to survey potential weaknesses. A deliberate attempt to bring the bishop into the game, aiming for an active diagonal and potentially bolstering the kingside defenses, though it cedes the initiative on the kingside and opens lines for white's queen. Recapturing the pawn with the queen subtly reclaims central influence while preparing to contest the d-file, a key thoroughfare that has become a focal point of contention after white's earlier pawn sacrifice and black's knight repositioning. The bishop finally finds an active diagonal, eyeing the e5 knight and potentially supporting a future f5 push, but it might be venturing too far into enemy territory without adequate pawn cover, especially with white's central pawns poised for advancement. Unleashing the kingside pawns to create a potent attacking spearhead, this move boldly aims to pry open lines and exploit the seemingly safe but potentially exposed white king. Fleeing the looming pressure on the e-file and offering a temporary pawn shield, this maneuver is a pragmatic concession of central space, gambling on the eventual reinforcement of the d6 bishop and the potential for counterplay on the queenside. Reclaiming the central knight establishes white's piece harmony, aiming to regroup for a kingside assault or potentially contest the d-file more actively, while black's pawn structure now looks a bit stretched on the queenside after the exchange of pieces. Initiating an exchange of bishops here, though seemingly straightforward, significantly reshapes the central control and opens up potential diagonal pressure. This pawn structure is becoming quite complex, and that bishop's departure from the queenside might allow white to eventually dominate the open c-file. Think about how the remaining pieces on both sides now relate to each other, especially given black's slightly restricted kingside development. This decision might also be seen as a slight weakening of the dark squares around black's monarch, which could become a target if white finds a way to exploit it. Consider the long-term implications of this piece trade on the fluidity of the game. Securing the king's immediate safety from potential tactical skirmishes, this defensive maneuver aims to create crucial breathing room on the kingside by preempting any aggressive pawn thrusts or piece intrusions that might have been brewing. Reclaiming central influence, this maneuver seeks to activate the rook to the open file, eyeing white's pawn structure and offering a potential outpost for the knight should it find a way to traverse the board. Finally, a sensible retreat for the bishop, unshackling the d-file and preparing to contest it, acknowledging the subtle positional concessions made earlier. Rethinking piece placement, black repositions the bishop from its advanced outpost, seeking greater defensive solidity and potentially preparing for a later sortie of the a5 knight. The rook sliding to the b-file asserts dominion over an open file, creating a potent battery with the queen and setting the stage for potential breakthroughs against black's castled position. Proposing an immediate pawn push to a5 aims to curb white's queenside expansion, but risks weakening the b5 square and potentially creating a backward pawn if white can exploit the a-file. Recognizing the need for active piece development and asserting influence over the central squares, white repositions their bishop to an outpost that simultaneously reinforces the d4 pawn and prepares to challenge black's dark-squared control. Recognizing the bishop's pressure on the long diagonal, black repositions the piece to d6, seeking better defensive coordination and preparing to contest the crucial c5 square, aiming to disrupt white's anticipated queenside expansion. Shattering the pawn chain, this audacious advance disrupts black's cozy central presence and introduces immediate diagonal pressure towards the queen's side, demanding a precise response to avoid structural concessions. Challenging white's central pawn storm with this bishop retreat recognizes the need to redeploy the piece, which has been awkwardly placed since capturing on c4 earlier. Instead of passively defending, this maneuver seeks to activate the bishop, aiming for squares like c5 or a7 to disrupt white's queenside expansion and potentially launch counterplay against the advanced pawns. The idea is to avoid being pinned or traded off unfavorably as white continues to build pressure. The doubled rooks now eye the now unprotected c-file, creating immediate pressure on black's position and forcing a reevaluation of their defensive setup. Black seeks to alleviate the cramped nature of their pieces by offering a trade that might open up the queenside for counterplay, while simultaneously bolstering the defense of the light-squared bishop. Liberating the c-file for your rooks with 27, cxb6 unlocks potent attacking potential, shattering the pawn chain and creating immediate threats against black's king position. The queen repositions itself to a more active square, eyeing white's slightly weakened kingside pawn structure now that the pawn is pushed. This redeployment also prepares for potential skirmishes along the c-file, aiming to contest control and develop threats against white's central coordination. Opening the c-file with this capture immediately challenges black's control and aims to exploit the doubled pawns if they recaptures carelessly, potentially creating pathways for rooks into less defended areas. The rook reclamation on the open file is a necessary recapture, though it cedes the crucial dark square control that was so carefully cultivated. The knight's journey to e1 is a curious repositioning, hinting at a potential shift in the pressure on the queenside or a subtle attempt to connect the rooks more effectively along the central files. It's a quiet maneuver, a preparatory step that might seem unassuming but could unlock new attacking avenues or simply consolidate white's position before launching a more direct assault. Reclaiming the central queen immediately addresses white's doubled pawns and pressure on the c-file, establishing a more solid defensive structure and eyeing counterplay on the queen side. Unlocking the c-file's potential, the knight repositions to a more active square, hinting at a coordinated assault on black's weakened kingside pawns by potentially supporting a future kingside pawn push. Challenging the queenside control and aiming to disrupt white's king safety, this bold queen sortie suddenly injects tactical complexity, forcing white to reevaluate the delicate balance of forces and potentially opening lines for further complications. Purging the queens from a complex position can simplify things, but here it forces a premature endgame where black's active pieces, especially the bishop poised on b4, hold a significant positional advantage. The piece swap on c2, while removing a central attacking force, unfortunately abandons the fight for initiative and surrenders key central squares without a strong counterplan. The rook's infiltration onto the second rank immediately seizes control of a key open file, setting the stage for a potential rook endgame where active pieces are paramount. Capturing the isolated pawn on b4 decisively simplifies the position, leaving black with a doubled pawn on the c-file and no clear compensation for the material deficit. A desperate gambit to seize initiative, sacrificing the rook for an exposed king and a chance to disrupt white's pawn structure, hoping to create counterplay against the now vulnerable monarch before the inevitable pawn majority on the queen side can be brought to bear. The king vacates its defended but potentially exposed central post, setting the stage for rook activity and aiming to consolidate within the upcoming pawn-rich endgame. With pawns now spread across the board, black's capture aims to liberate the rook from its defensive duties, simultaneously creating a passed pawn threat down the file and forcing white's king to a precarious central square. Initiating a clear endgame transition, this rook exchange liberates white's king from potential central pressure and aims to exploit the isolated pawn on b4, a lingering weakness that could become a target for the king and rook. The rook's foray to the third rank injects immediate dynamism, seeking to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure and potentially uncover attacking lines against the isolated king. Unlocking the queenside pawn's potential becomes paramount as this piece ventures to d2, aiming to activate the rook on the now open c-file and exert pressure against black's isolated pawn. Black's capture on h3 dramatically alters the endgame's material balance and pawn structure, potentially opening avenues for the king while simultaneously creating immediate tactical threats and requiring white to carefully consider their king's safety. Solidifying the pawn chain's dominance on the queen side, this advance aims to restrict black's maneuvering space and create potential weaknesses to exploit later. Initiating a daring pawn push to infiltrate white's queenside, aiming to disrupt white's defensive structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the file. A bold check, seeking to disrupt the opponent's coordination and exploit the recent exchange on the c-file, potentially forcing a king escape that could lead to discovered threats or an advantageous piece trade. The king's journey to the wings, while sometimes unavoidable, often exposes vulnerabilities, and this step further highlights the king's precarious position on the exposed queenside flank. The bishop suddenly activates, seeking to exploit the vulnerable pawn structure on the kingside and potentially disrupt black's king's safety by opening lines. Securing that pawn allows the rook to become an active participant on the open file, pressuring white's king and creating future attacking possibilities. Ramping up pressure, the rook now lurks on the open central file, eyeing the weakened pawns and preparing a pincer against that stranded knight. This thrust aims to disrupt white's tidy pawn structure and create potential attacking avenues on the kingside, but it risks weakening black's own king's safety by opening lines. The monarch's forcing departure from the king's protection now opens a direct assault path for the white rook, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and coordinate with the remaining pieces for a swift conclusion. The black king, now exposed to the open files and facing imminent checks, attempts to find some sanctuary behind the pawn chain, but this maneuver offers only a fleeting illusion of safety, as white's rook and bishop stand poised to exploit the king's predicament. Pushing the rook back to the 8th rank initiates a strategic maneuver to gain control of the open file and potentially force concessions from black's otherwise solid defensive structure. Introducing dynamism to the kingside assault, this pawn advance signals an intent to pry open lines and create attacking opportunities against white's somewhat exposed monarch. The king ventures out, seeking a safer haven on the queen's side. Seeking a fresh avenue for infiltration, black advances the pawn, hoping to pry open new attacking lines against the somewhat exposed white monarch, though it also invites a potential counterthrust on the kingside. The rook finally finds an active outpost on the 8th rank, a significant improvement from its earlier passive defensive duties on the c-file, now eyeing the isolated pawn and potentially creating mating threats against the exposed black monarch. A daring infiltration into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and create counterplay with the active rook, though it risks overextension. The rook ventures towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn formation and potentially trap the king should it venture out of its current safe haven. The black monarch, having survived its trek across the battlefield, now finds itself in a precarious position, actively seeking refuge as white's rook relentlessly hunts. Clearing the f-file opens a direct assault on black's vulnerable king, aiming to exploit the exposed pawn structure and create mating threats. The creation of that pawn passed on the king side offers a new dimension to the endgame, potentially drawing the white king into a desperate defensive posture. This rook retreat is a pragmatic choice, acknowledging the lost initiative and focusing on consolidation rather than immediate confrontation. By shifting the rook to the edge, white aims to support the pawn's advance and prevent it from becoming a weakness under black's potential pressure on the queen side. The long-term objective is to create a passed pawn, a common endgame goal, while avoiding further complications in the center. That pawn's journey now targets the newly cleared king path, aiming to create a dangerous passed threat. Seeking to reinforce the queen side, this maneuver aims to secure the c3 square and potentially launch a pawn advance on the file, exploiting the currently exposed black king. The king, exposed and abandoned, now scrambles desperately for safety, but the pawns ahead of it offer little to no cover. Sacrificing the bishop to funnel the black king into a desperate chase creates an endgame where white can consolidate their material advantage. Black's monarch finds itself in a perilous position. Bringing the king to the center, despite the seemingly open lines, offers a tempting target for white's remaining active pieces, particularly the rook on the 7th rank. Unleashing the king from its defensive shell initiates a dangerous endgame chase, aiming to exploit the bishop pair's potential for swarming the weakened black king. Capturing the rook with the promoted queen creates a dramatic shift, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated attack and exploit the newly opened diagonal for the black queen.